Hello, my name's Justin Stairs. This is the Brussels Signal Studio, and our special guest today is one of our very own, Peter Caddle, who is a Brussels Signal journalist, and he is specialised, one of his many specialities is EU big tech regulation. So we're going to talk about what's happening in that sphere, and it's particularly relevant this month because the European Commission has fined Apple 1.8 billion euros. That's a lot of money. What did they do wrong?
Well,
Peter?
the European Commission found them guilty of engaging in anti-competitive practices. So what does that mean? Basically, their streaming platform in the music streaming area, Apple Music, had a advantage over their third-party competitors on iPhone. So think Deezer, Spotify, these kind of platforms. Basically, Apple put in place rules on iPhone devices that made it so that these platforms had to charge more effectively than they would have to on an Android phone or a Windows tablet.
So this is monopoly-like behaviour, taking advantages of a monopoly-like position. Is that what we're talking about here?
They were fined for violating European antitrust rules.
Right.
So Margaret Vestager came out and actually issued a statement after the fine was issued saying that Apple has basically disadvantaged the European consumer, basically because of what Apple did, because of how Apple regulated their own platforms, because Apple has total control over iPhones in terms of what you can see, what's allowed on these devices, which has advantages, but it also means that basically if Apple says something, every single third-party developer has to follow those rules. And those rules, according to the European Commission, were unfair and violated European law.
Right. So obviously, Margaret Vestager is the Brussels Competition Commissioner, and she's essentially fined Apple for not letting in competitors. Is this basically it?
Basically, there is something called an Apple tax. That's what it's
Apple
known
tax.
as. Basically, anytime you buy something through an Apple device using the Apple payment system,
Right.
Apple takes a 30% cut.
Okay.
So these companies, so likes of Spotify, whenever they were charging you, if you wanted to buy a music subscription with them, would have to tag on an extra 30% on the label price for Apple.
For Apple, they're taking a cut.
Yeah. Now, all these companies, or a lot of them, had lower prices on their website. So if you wanted, to avoid the Apple tax, you could. However, Apple specifically forbade them from mentioning those lower prices,
Right.
either on the apps themselves,
Right.
or more importantly, and this has been a big subject of controversy, even through email.
Right. Well, that doesn't sound fair, does it? So, I mean, do you think that this is a good thing, and will Apple mend its ways? I presume the fact that they paid the fine means that, well, they will pay the fine, means that they'll change their practices or not?
Now, Apple, because of how EU law works, has been forced to pay the fine, but they have announced they're appealing the decision. They have been adamant that they've done nothing wrong here, that especially on the issue of Spotify, who was one of the main players behind the push for this investigation in the first place. They said that, Apple is one of the reasons why Spotify is so successful, that, it was only through reach on iPhone that this European company, is one of the few big tech players
right.
in Europe, was so successful. And
is that fair?
There's definitely a degree where it's fair. Now, of course, Spotify have come out and said, well, actually, we're one of the reasons why iPhone's successful.
Okay.
Because there's no point in buying a phone where you can't buy third-party apps. So there's a back and forth here, but the European Commission has found soundly in Spotify's favour. Now, there's going to be a prolonged legal battle over this. Apple has vowed to fight it. But for the time being, they've had to pay that 1.8 billion euro fine.
Right. And so does that mean you can now download Spotify without going to the App Store?
No, that's a different thing. But we should get into it. The Digital Markets Act has just come into force this month. What does that mean for European consumers? Basically, it's the sister act to the Digital Services Act. For any of our regular readers, you've been hearing a lot about that recently. But what does the Digital Markets Act actually mean? Basically, the EU has designated a bunch of gatekeeper companies. So these big tech companies that have been deemed so big that they have, if not a monopoly, such a sizable share in a market that very few people can compete. So think Apple and its iOS platform, the operating system used on iPhone. That has been designated a core platform, meaning that under the Digital Markets Act, as of this month, they need to open up that platform to third-party competitors.
As do others. Give me a couple more examples.
For example, Google and their Play Store on Android, they have to open that up in terms of the personal computing space. Windows, Microsoft's operating system, has also been subject to these changes.
Right.
And that means that these companies now need to effectively give their competitors access to their own software because they're so big. And for the European Commission, this means more competition. This means a better, more diverse market, more consumer choice. For a lot of these companies, especially Apple, this means higher risk in terms of security. Apple is saying that one of the reasons why iPhone is so good is because it's a closed garden, meaning that only Apple is allowed to decide what is allowed to go on iPhone.
What is safe.
Yes, exactly. And that means that they can screen out malware. That means they can make sure that there isn't fraudulent apps. Now, of course, no system is perfect, but Apple does have a reputation of having far more secure devices than their competitors. And that's partly because of this walled garden effect.
Okay. So they have to dismantle the wall.
Yes, they have to dismantle the wall, but the question is how much. And this has been a big subject of controversy because Apple has begrudgingly acquiesced to its responsibilities on the Digital Markets Act. It has complained this is going to, endanger security for our users, but it's the law, so we'll have to do it. But for a lot of their competitors, they're not exactly happy with how Apple has done it. For example, they've had to enable a thing called side loading on iPhone devices. What does that mean? So right now, for a vast majority of users listening to this podcast, you want to get an app on your phone. You go into whatever app store you have. That could be the Amazon Marketplace, Apple App Store, Google Play Store, whatever. And you find that app and you download it. Now, those apps have to obey the rules of that app store. And what sideloading means is you can go directly to a company's website. So I can bypass...
Outside the store.
Yeah, totally outside the store. Right. I can go onto my web browser on my iPhone and go to Spotify and download it directly from the source, bypassing the whole system. So that's how it's worked on Android for quite a while, but now it's going to be like that on iPhone. Except these side-loaded apps will also have to obey certain rules under the Apple ecosystem. All of these apps, for example, will have to be vetted. They would have to be notarized, which basically means that Apple can get to do an automatic screen, make sure there's no malware in it and everything else. But this has been far more contentious, is that any developer of these apps has to be in good standing with Apple. They've had to have been active within Apple Europe for 2 years, and they have to have had an app that was downloaded 1 million times or more over the previous year.
Right, sort of like a trusted partner scheme.
Exactly,
or something
very
like
much like a trusted partner scheme. And a lot of companies are not happy with this, especially because as part of this trusted partner scheme, every app that is on this new terms of service, effectively, each time it's downloaded, anytime over the 1 million install mark, it has to pay Apple 50 cents.
So the way Apple are complying with the legislation does not please some.
No, it does not.
How about the Commission?
The Commission has not made a statement exactly on this yet, but they have very much made clear that they are aware that this is a point of controversy. For example, Margaret Vestager, in her statement after handing out that 1.8 billion euro fine, also mentioned there's been questions over whether these new rules are compatible with the Digital Markets Act.
Yeah.
And she confirmed we're looking into this.
Did I see a video of her on Twitter or something downloading an app from outside the store? Is that what I saw?
Well, Breton has been... Internal Market Commissioner Thierry Breton
has
been arguably even more, how would you say, bombastic
Good word.
with his inflammatory remarks here, in that Apple has had a long time feud going with a company called Epic Games. You'll know them
Games, right.
probably as the creators, as the creators of Fortnite. Now, this company has been feuding with Apple over its App Store rules, over the 30% Apple tax I mentioned earlier, and has been thrown off a lot of Apple platforms because of that. Now, as part of the Digital Markets Act, they were allowed access within the European market again, and they were planning to develop their own app store for iPhone, which is perfectly allowed under the Digital Markets Act. Apple has to let that happen. However, Apple turned around and actually banned their developer account because Apple said, these guys have constantly violated our trust, they've constantly violated our agreements, we don't want them on our platform. Thierry Breton took to social media and went, we're aware that this, Epic Games has been thrown off of Apple's ecosystem. We're investigating. 2 days later, he came back onto social media and went, don't worry, we've talked to Apple. They've let them back on again, even using the hashtag #FreeFortnite.
Right, so he claims that the European Commission put pressure on Apple and that it worked, essentially.
Not just Thierry Breton, but Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic Games, effectively handed the credit for this to the European Commission.
Right, okay. Well, that sounds like it's a good thing for consumers. Is that fair to say? Or gamers? They must be happy?
Well, in terms of, is it good for gamers? Well, the obvious benefit here is if there's a way for, you to play Fortnite on iPhone again, I think a lot of people will be happy about that. It hasn't been available since 2020, effectively.
Okay.
But
maybe a cheaper version?
Again, yes, in the sense of if you can get around the Apple tax, which is unsure at the moment, it could be good for consumers. But there's also the question here of Apple built this ecosystem. Shouldn't it not benefit from having, created effectively the platform that, its argument is it helped Spotify become as big as it did. It helped Apple or Epic Games get as big as it did. Should it not benefit from that? And will restricting these companies lower competition in the market instead of increase it? These are big questions that nobody really has the answer to yet. We're going to, as the Digital Markets Act goes on,
the Commission says it's doing this because it wants to increase competition, right? How could its legislation actually have the opposite effect, which is what Apple might suggest, right?
Well, it's a case of, will these companies have as big an incentive to develop themselves in this market? I think this is more easily seen with another piece of legislation that's moving through the European legislative process right now, which is the Artificial Intelligence Act.
Okay.
In that the AI Act effectively is going to be the world's first comprehensive regulation.
EU AI Act.
Yes, the EU's AI Act. It's been a point of pride for the Commission and many MEPs, as we're going to be the first on the scene to put in place stringent regulations. We are going to ban a bunch of uses for AI. We're going to heavily regulate others that are deemed high risk. And with this, we're going to get out ahead of the pack. And that means that, our regulations will become the standard worldwide. This is what's happened, they claim, with GDPR, their data protection.
Which is a fair claim, isn't it?
It is a fair claim in some ways, though arguably the GDPR has made it more difficult for European businesses to, trade with consumers here.
Okay.
And that has been the argument with the Artificial Intelligence Act, is that this is going to possibly hamstring the development of European AI over the longer term. So it's a case of, with regulation comes bureaucracy. With bureaucracy, comes, more paperwork for businesses.
Okay, all right. I can see the two sides to that argument. Now, is it fair to say that Apple is here in Brussels is sort of a bit of a bad boy, isn't it? Because we've been discussing these issues about the App Store and what have you, but there is another issue that's been going on for at least 10 years in my memory, and that is Apple chargers, Lightning ports, USB-C and all that. Explain, please.
This is actually a bit of a historical battle Apple has had going with the European Commission, one that it's lost at this point, where basically the European Commission and the European Parliament agreed that they wanted a standard charger for phones across the European Union. And it was originally decided to be micro USB, and that eventually evolved into USB-C over time. But Apple went, no, we have Lightning, and Lightning admittedly was originally far stronger than micro USB in many ways, and they wanted to stick with that. Now, they got around that by making their Lightning charger compatible with USB-C. You could get a dongle so that one works with the other. But eventually, after each time Apple kind of figured a way around the European regulations, European Commission put their foot down, went, no, we're pushing this USB-C only. You're doing USB-C or you're not in our market. And with iPhone 15, they did implement USB-C. They claim because it's a better connector, better data transfer, that's why they put it there. But a lot of analysts say it's because they wanted to maintain access to the European market, and to do that, they had to play by the European Commission, the European Parliament
So
rules.
the Commission has slowly got its way on these issues.
So far, anyway, and it's quite difficult not to get your way when you're the regulator. It's the question of what kind of impact those regulations have on the European market in the long term. A lot of eyes are on the Digital Markets Act now in terms of how it's being enforced against Apple, because like how Elon Musk's X has really kind of become the whipping boy in some ways for the Digital Services Act.
Right. We're going on from the Digital Markets Act to the Digital Services Act.
Different. It's obviously Elon Musk is this big free speech warrior in the US, has seemingly drawn the ire of the European Commission, who has been adamant that X must play by its rules, at least in the European Union. So that means, in terms of questions of hate speech, it has to have reporting systems available, and has to, when hate speech is brought to the platform's attention, quickly and accurately delete it. So the Digital Services Act has basically, largely been tested with X, and in that way, Apple seems to be the test case for the Digital Markets Act. Now, a lot of companies are going to be looking at this with a lot of anxiety, because Digital Service Act, which is the one that X is being subject to, has a penalty of up to 6% of
global
turnover,
right,
which is a big hit for any company.
Yeah.
With the Digital Markets Act, this is the one that Apple's being subjected to.
Right.
That's 10%.
Why the difference?
Basically deemed a more serious
Okay.
more serious
More serious
violation.
crime.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
these are big companies that, for example, I brought up Microsoft Windows is under the gatekeeper aspects of the Digital Markets Act. Chrome, which is the operating system run by Google or the Alphabet company. All of these companies have benefited in many ways from controlling these ecosystems, and opening them up is likely going to cost them a lot of money.
Right.
So the question of how effective the Digital Markets Act can be enforced is going to be a big issue for them.
And they're going to fight it with their lawyers and try and delay it. I presume this is the classic corporate tactic.
Well, the argument is that Apple has been trying to, letter of the law, placate the Digital Markets Act as much as possible. There's been disagreements. Apple's not the only company with issues here. Google has had to make changes to some of their products under the Digital Markets Act, and they've been challenged on it in terms of their use of the Chrome browser. Yelp has come out and said, well, the changes Google have made to their products hasn't been good enough. Google has said, of course it has. Here's our data saying it is.
Right.
And when there's a sort of Damocles of 10% of your global turnover hanging over your head,
Right.
these are big questions. And
Now, you've mentioned Google, Microsoft, X, Apple, right? Now, this is sounding like a sort of EU vendetta against big US tech companies. I've heard that said. Is there any truth to it?
Well, in terms of truth, depends on who you ask, of course. Now, if you ask Senator Ted Cruz, a Republican senator from Texas, the answer to that is a well and truly yes. He's written to European regulators regulators going, this seems to be vendetta against, American tech companies. He's also written to the FCC, the US regulator, complaining that you helped build this Digital Markets Act. Here's a list of meetings you attended with European regulators and regarding setting this up. How could you do this? You've disadvantaged our own companies. And he's been chasing that up. Is that fair? I think we'll see with time. For example, today, not the Digital Markets Act, but the sister act, the Digital Services Act, the European Commission has launched an investigation into Alibaba's AliExpress shopfront. It's guilty of nearly 24, about 12, different articles of the Digital Services Act it's accused of violating. Now, that's an accusation. They're investigating this now, but that is just one day after the passing of a very inflammatory bill in the the U.S. House of Representatives, which basically has ordered TikTok's owner ByteDance to divest from
sell or shut down.
Sell or shut down. So this seems to indicate that there is at least a growing level of tension between the West, so Europe, United States, and China, Chinese companies.
And it seems like in this worldwide battle between the blocs that Europe doesn't have many players. I mean, we have the European Commission, which is regulating, but where are the tech giants in Europe?
Well, we have mentioned Spotify. That's a big exception to the US-China tech war, if you will. It's a European company. But the fact that it's an exception kind of proves the rule here, and that Europe really hasn't been nearly as big of a player in this market as the other world superpowers, effectively.
Why not?
People will argue over this. Europe really has so far prioritized its position as what it calls a regulatory superpower, as in we have the power, we have a massive market, one of the biggest single market in the world. And that means we can put in a bunch of regulations protecting our consumers, meaning that everyone else will have to follow our rules or else. But there's been questions over whether this approach has benefited local industry.
Well, does it create jobs, this approach,
well,
apart from for lawyers?
Does it create jobs? Does it create industry? Does it create an advantage here? Because if we go back to the question of artificial intelligence, there's a big push towards that as the next big thing. China and the US are battling for dominance there. We've seen sanctions from the US side against the delivery of certain hardware to China, which is deemed that it could give them an advantage in the AI race. And France have come out and said they want to be a big player here. They want to work hard. There was a report from the French government yesterday which outlined 25 possible routes towards, AI power status, including the investment of 10 billion euro this year and 5 billion euro each year for the next 5 years, which is a big investment. They say it's worth it. We want to be in this race. It's the next big thing.
I'm wondering if governments can conjure up tech giants like that by just throwing money out at it. Don't we need the entrepreneurs more than the governments to actually create rivals to the likes of Alphabet and Microsoft?
It's the question of our era, really, in the sense of we've seen multiple approaches to this. The United States' approach, has been the Silicon Valley one, which is venture capitalist, private entities,
free market.
Well, it's like the old tech adage, move fast, break things.
Right.
China's taken a slightly different approach. It does have private entities, but it's far more interlinked with state apparatus there. Europe has largely taken a more open market approach than China, but a more closed system approach than the United States. Has it worked so far? Arguably not. Could that change in the future? Maybe it could. There were concerns regarding the Artificial Intelligence Act at the EU level, that it could disadvantage native tech. So France, Germany were initially against it, which is one of the two biggest economies in the European Union.
But they were bought off or something with an amendment.
They were pressured by the Commission, put it that way. And while there were some token gestures effectively, there weren't many amendments to the act. And France fought hard for, some loosening, especially for its company Mistral AI, which has been its big AI darling effectively within the European Union. The Paris has pointed to this company and went, look, European AI is possible. Look how good this is. And in the wake of a deal being done to get this AI Act moving forward, Mistral AI has done a deal with Microsoft to develop its products, which, a lot of people within the European Parliament have gone, well, look,
what's the point?
Yeah, it was like, we were sold this wonderful narrative about independent European artificial intelligence development, and in comes the US tech giant once again, sweeping up the smaller company. They didn't buy it, but the deal is actually similar in structure to its one with OpenAI, which Elon Musk is very angry about. Let's not get into that. That'll take.
And quick question before we wrap things up. The UK, of course, outside of the European Union,
Yes.
and therefore not subject to
Not
the same
subject to-
regulations?
Not subject to the same regulations, but looking to implement something very similar.
Okay.
Now, the UK has a little bit of advantage here, according to some analysts, in that it gets to see the goods and the bads with the Digital Markets Act, and can maybe tweak bits of legislation here and there to, they're going to
Cherry pick the
exactly.
good bits.
They'll come second in this race, but maybe second is where you want to be. And of course, as an independent economy outside the European Union, they will be able to react and change their legislation faster than the European Union can, because they don't have 27 member states to convince here. Now, of course, we won't get into the Brexit debacle in the sense of, is that worth it? Is it not having access to the EU market? But in this regard, there seems to be an angle for extra competitiveness here while protecting UK consumers.
So then, in summary, these changes which the EC is forcing upon the US big tech industry, they are pro-consumer.
At least in the face of it, and in the short term. For example, it's a case of, as a iPhone owner now, what this means is that you will have more options about where you can get your apps. And in theory, you'll have more diversity in regards to what those apps can be. Now, that will come at a price. It will probably come at a price in terms of security. There'll probably be more malware around, because Apple will just not have that same level of control that they used to have, which they prided themselves on. But overall, if you're careful, and I always encourage people to be careful online, there will be short-term advantages. Whether that's going to translate into long-term benefits for the European consumer remains to be seen.
Wonderful. As you can see, Peter Caddle knows what he's talking about. You can read more on this subject on our website, because he's writing about it on a weekly, if not daily basis, or you can come back for some more of this. We should do another one of these podcasts when the European Commission targets the next big company. In fact, it's got several other companies in its sites, right?
Maybe sooner than you think,
including Pornhub, and who else is?
Yes, some big porn companies have been recently designated under the Digital Services Act. They've been designated very large online platforms, which comes with obligations, and they're not quite happy about that.
Right.
So that's one thing
maybe we should do a porn podcast. How about that? Anyway, are you up for it?
I'll get back to you on that one.
My name is Justin Says. He's Peter Caddle. This is the Brussels Signal Studio. Thanks a lot for watching.